On September 19, 1944, mist rolled over the fields near Arracourt, France. First Lieutenant Merwin Marston of the 37th Tank Battalion clutched the rim of his Sherman's turret while his gunner scanned through the periscope, searching the fog-shrouded ground ahead. They'd been cautioned about Panthers, the fearsome German tanks whose angled armor had long deflected ordinary American shells. What Marston and his men didn't realize was that within their ammo rack sat 6 rounds that would transform the strategy of armored combat. 6 M93 High-Velocity Armor-Piercing shells, each built with a tungsten carbide core, could turn their medium Sherman into something German crews would soon regard as an unforeseen menace. The mental shock these shells inflicted proved as potent as their ability to pierce armor, demolishing German confidence in American tanks and forcing them to rethink the notion that Panthers were unstoppable. The tale of how a single type of ammunition shifted the balance of tank warfare begins not in France, but in U.S. factories and testing fields, where metallurgists and ballistics experts raced to fix a flaw that endangered American armored strength in Europe. In early 1944, the U.S. Army faced a crisis few planners had foreseen. The M4 Sherman, cornerstone of America's armored units, was meeting German tanks it could not beat head-on. The Panther, Germany's response to the Soviet T-34, combined a powerful 75mm high-speed cannon with an 80mm frontal plate angled at 55 degrees, producing about 140mm of effective protection that most U.S. shells couldn't breach. Intelligence had misjudged both how many Panthers there would be and how advanced they were. By June 1944, when the Allies stormed Normandy, nearly 38% of German armor there were Panthers, not the few expected, but hundreds of these deadly machines, sometimes manned by green crews, yet shielded by armor the usual American guns couldn't pierce. The 75mm M3 gun on most Shermans in Normandy couldn't break a Panther's front plate at any range. Shots merely ricocheted off the sloped hull, leaving Sherman crews exposed to the Panther's powerful cannon, which could blast them from over 2 kilometers away. Even the upgraded 76mm M1 gun, appearing in July 1944, found the Panther's armor tough to crack. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped ammunition, the 76mm could pierce 109mm of plate at 1 kilometer with no angle. That worked against Panzer IVs and many German assault guns, but the Panther's slanted front remained virtually immune. The 76mm could punch through the gun mantlet, but only at perilously close range, under 100 meters, where the Panther's superior firepower made such duels suicidal. The true weakness wasn't the gun design, but the shells it fired. Even introducing the 76mm gun had been a story of bureaucratic delay and late realization. The first M4 Shermans with the M1 76mm left factories in January 1944. These M4 A176 Shermans reached Britain by April 10, 1944, with 130 delivered for the Normandy build-up. Yet commanders chose not to use them on D-Day. Reasons varied. Crews hadn't trained enough on the new armament, supply logistics were complicated by needing 2 ammunition types, and most leaders assumed the 75mm gun would suffice. That assumption proved disastrous. By early July 1944, field reports from Normandy were grim. On July 2nd, complaints about the 75mm failure against German tanks reached General Dwight Eisenhower, whose reply, preserved in several records, revealed mounting command frustration. "You're telling me our 76 won't destroy these Panthers?" Someone demanded. I had been led to believe it would be the war's miracle weapon. Witness accounts record the rest of the outburst in much stronger terms, conveying his fury that ordnance had guaranteed the 76mm would handle any German threat. A board assembled on July 12, 1944, formally confirmed what crews had painfully learned in combat. Conventional American tank weapons could not reliably knock out Panthers from the front. General Omar Bradley ordered the 76mm armed Shermans shipped from Britain straight to the lines. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, 102 M4A-176 tanks entered battle for the first time. Early combat reports were sobering. Although the 76mm offered an improvement over the older 75mm, it still struggled to defeat Panther frontal armor at realistic engagement distances. Sherman crews rapidly discovered they had to maneuver for flank shots or close in to attack the Panther's gun mantlet, tactics that were tactically undesirable against a vehicle capable of destroying them at 2 kilometers. The answer came from metallurgy and ballistics. By July 1944, U.S. ordnance specialists had produced the T-4 projectile, later standardized as the M93 HVAP. High-velocity armor-piercing ammunition marked a radical shift from ordinary AP rounds. The projectile used a tungsten carbide penetrator, one of the hardest substances available, encased in a lightweight aluminum sheath with a ballistic cap. That arrangement focused the fired energy into a smaller, much denser penetrator while keeping the overall shell light. The effect was significant. The M93 reached a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second versus 792 meters per second for the standard M62. That 244 meters per second advantage translated into much greater penetration. At 1,000 yards, about 914 meters, the HVAP round could perforate 160 millimeters of homogeneous armor at 10 degrees obliquity, according to War Department trials. Against the Panther's gun mantlet, which on early Ors-found variants featured roughly 100 millimeters of cast, curved steel, and was increased to about 120 millimeters on later Orsfa, D and A models, this meant dependable penetration out to 1,000 meters instead of only at point-blank range. The mantlet thus became an attainable aim for Sherman crews who previously had to attempt hazardous flank attacks or withdraw. However, producing HVAP was only half the battle. Manufacturing at scale posed its own problems. The T-4 relied on tungsten carbide, a strategic mineral largely sourced from China, which before the war supplied roughly 36% of the world's tungsten. Tungsten was essential across many war industries: machine tools, armor-piercing ordnance of several calibers, armor hardening, and assorted industrial uses all vied for limited stocks. American HVAP production alone demanded hundreds of metric tons annually. Each 76mm HVAP round incorporated about 0.8 kilograms of tungsten carbide, so a Sherman load of 6 rounds consumed close to 5 kilograms of the scarce material. China produced nearly 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates in 1944, but that figure had to support all Allied requirements across myriad applications. The United States augmented Chinese shipments with domestic production from small deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but overall availability remained tight. Germany's access was worse. Swedish exports fell as the war progressed, and local production stayed tiny. By 1945, German industry hoarded tungsten desperately for machine tools needed in aircraft engine manufacture, while Panther units often had to make do with standard ammunition. The U.S. Ordnance Department had experimented with HVAP projectiles since spring 1942, yet mass production lagged until after Normandy exposed the Panther threat. In July 1944, manufacture of 3-inch HVAP rounds for tank destroyers reached 1,000 units. Production then accelerated as priorities shifted, and limited shipments were allocated to frontline units, where they made a disproportionate tactical difference. Crews carrying the scarce rounds often reserved them for the most dangerous encounters, knowing a single effective hit could neutralize a Panther and alter local combat outcomes, buying time until broader supply improved, increasingly so. In August, production yielded 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition, with another 1,076 manufactured in September. It wasn't until November 1944 that monthly output climbed to 5,000 rounds for the 76mm, increasing again to 7,000 per month by January 1945. By March 1945, roughly 33,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP had been completed, a major industrial accomplishment, yet still far below the frontline need. By February 1945, the typical 76mm Sherman in Europe carried only 5 HVAP rounds, 5 shots to face an enemy for whom the Panther had become standard equipment. A company of 17 Shermans would thus hold just 85 HVAP rounds total, while German formations could field 30 or more Panthers. The first HVAP shipments arrived in Europe in August 1944, though their appearance was overshadowed by broader tactical challenges. The dense Normandy hedgerows had forced American armor into point-blank combat, where better-armed German tanks ambushed advancing Shermans. Crews faced enemies who had learned to place Panthers in hull-down positions, revealing only the thickly protected turret while keeping the weaker hull obscured. German doctrine stressed first-shot accuracy, with Panthers waiting in pre-sighted firing zones, allowing American columns to come close before striking from distances where U.S. return fire was useless. The psychological toll on American tankers was immense. Many began calling the Sherman the Ronson lighter, claiming it ignited whenever hit. Although later studies revealed this belief was exaggerated, the fear profoundly influenced behavior. When commanders spotted Panthers, they often called for artillery or air support rather than engage directly, handing the initiative to an opponent that could, in fact, be beaten with the right munitions and tactics. The introduction of HVAP began to alter this mindset, though slowly, hindered by limited supplies and unfamiliarity with the round's strengths and weaknesses. The first broad test of HVAP came not in Normandy's close terrain, but across the open plains of Lorraine, where U.S. armored divisions, freed from the hedgerows, faced German defenses in country better suited to mobile warfare. In September 1944, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army pushed deep into France, advancing toward Germany with supply lines strained to their limit. The 4th Armored Division, one of America's most capable, had driven rapidly forward, capturing a bridgehead over the Moselle River near Arracourt. German commanders quickly recognized the danger. If Patton's forces reached the Rhine and crossed into Germany, the Reich's industrial core would be exposed. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army received orders to counterattack, destroy the American bridgehead, and stop Patton's offensive. For this operation, the Germans assembled 2 newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, armed mostly with brand-new Panthers straight from the factories. On paper, their advantage appeared decisive. Together, the brigades fielded about 150 tanks against Combat Command A of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, which had roughly 50 Shermans. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone entered combat with around 90 tanks and assault guns in total, 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer High-Fours. German planners expected a swift victory, believing the Panthers' technical superiority would offset American advantages in coordination and air power. They were gravely mistaken. The Battle of Arracourt, fought from September 18th to 29th, became the largest American tank engagement until the Battle of the Bulge. More importantly, it showed that with proper training, coordination, and new ammunition, American crews could overcome German technological superiority through better tactics, teamwork, and the smart use of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. At dawn on September 19th, a heavy fog covered the rolling countryside near Arracourt. German reconnaissance was almost non-existent, and the panzer brigades, lacking adequate scouting elements, advanced blindly into terrain held by American units who understood the ground and had already prepared their defenses. Around 8 in the morning, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade broke through American screening positions to the east and south of Arracourt. The German column, brand-new Panthers crewed by largely untested men, advanced in tight formation, a tactical mistake the experienced American tankers quickly capitalized on. Captain Kenneth R. Lameson's C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion held defensive lines covering the key approaches to Arracourt. His Sherman crews had been briefed about the special HVAP rounds stored in their racks, 6 per tank. Use them carefully, they had been warned. Aim for the turret or mantlet where the shot retains enough velocity to pierce. The same fog that blinded German scouts now became an ally to the defenders. One section of Lameson's Shermans guarded ground south of the village when the first Panther appeared out of the mist, no more than 75 meters away. At that range, the Panther's superior long-range gunnery meant nothing. The American gunner fired instantly. The HVAP shell, moving at over 1,000 meters per second, struck the Panther's mantlet squarely. The tungsten core bored through the curved cast steel and ignited the ammunition stacked just beneath the gun breech. The tank erupted, its turret lifting slightly from the force of the internal explosion. Moments later, 2 more Panthers emerged from the haze. Both were destroyed within seconds, their startled crews unable to react in the limited visibility. The remaining German tanks retreated, stunned that 3 of their machines had been lost so quickly to opponents they had been told were technically inferior. Throughout the morning of September 19th, similar battles unfolded across the Arracourt front. American tankers, shielded by fog, attacked Panthers at the close ranges where HVAP rounds achieved full effect. German tactical planning collapsed under its own errors. Advancing in columns without reconnaissance, the Panthers repeatedly presented their thinner side armor to American flank fire. Near Arracourt's command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, also using 76mm guns and HVAP rounds, engaged German armor at near point-blank distances. The quick, agile Hellcats proved devastating in the fog-bound close-range fight. By midday, as visibility improved, American forward observers began directing artillery in coordination with the tank units. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group arrived overhead, diving through openings in the clouds to hammer the German armor with rockets and machine gun bursts. The effect of American coordination became unmistakable. Although the Panther outclassed the Sherman in armor and gunpowder on paper, the Americans wielded combined arms warfare as standard doctrine. The German formations advanced without sufficient artillery, air cover, or infantry to clear defensive positions, while the Americans synchronized armor, artillery, air support, infantry, and tank destroyers into one cohesive system that nullified the German hardware advantage. When Panthers met these prepared defenses, they were picked off piece by piece despite their technical edge. HVAP ammunition did not make the Sherman equal to the Panther in engineering terms, but wars are not won by blueprints alone. Tanks fall to crews who exploit weaknesses under the conditions of battle. The Panther's mantlet, required for the elevation and traverse of its 75mm gun, formed a vulnerable point. The join between turret and hull, the side plating, and the engine deck were all areas HVAP-equipped Shermans could now target successfully at ranges that once meant certain death. More damaging than the physical losses was the blow to morale. Panther crews realized their supposed invincibility was gone. German tankers had been trained to believe their frontal armor could not be breached by American fire. Intelligence briefings had assured them the Sherman's guns lacked the strength to penetrate. They were told to face the enemy head-on and remain safe. The first Panther commanders to witness Sherman shells punching through their mantlets and detonating stored ammunition learned otherwise. Survivors carried that revelation back to their comrades, spreading the unsettling truth that American tanks now had the firepower to pierce Panthers. By that afternoon, German officers were radioing headquarters, reporting that the Shermans were using new, more lethal ammunition. Reports from the battlefield were chaotic and often contradictory. Some German officers claimed that the Americans had secretly introduced tank destroyers armed with 90mm guns. Others insisted that British 17-pounder Firefly tanks had been transferred to American formations. The truth, that U.S. industry had created specialized ammunition capable of offsetting much of the Panther's armor superiority, proved far more unsettling to German strategists than any of those rumors. It revealed that American manufacturing power could adapt to battlefield challenges faster than German industry could counter them. Fighting dragged on until September 22nd, when the main German assault finally ran out of momentum. American units had knocked out or disabled roughly 86 German tanks and assault guns, while losing 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers. Despite the Panther's technical edge, the kill ratio strongly favored the Americans. The Battle of Arracourt represented not only a battlefield success, but also a turning point in morale. American tank crews learned they could destroy Panthers without depending solely on dedicated tank destroyers or heavy air support. German tankers, meanwhile, lost their faith in the myth of absolute frontal protection. From the German point of view, Arracourt was marked by confusion and bitter reflection. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered combat with about 90 tanks and assault guns, had fewer than 20 vehicles still functional by September 29th. Post-battle German reports struggled to account for the defeat. On paper, their equipment had been superior. How could new tanks with powerful guns have been so thoroughly beaten by supposedly inferior opponents? The reasons lay partly in training and battlefield experience. The Panzer Brigade's crews had minimal preparation, many arriving after only a few weeks of instruction. In contrast, the American tankers of the 4th Armored Division were seasoned veterans who had fought across France, mastered combined arms warfare, and learned how to use terrain to their advantage. Yet even training differences could not fully explain the Panther losses, especially the penetrations that should have been impossible with normal U.S. shells. German intelligence officers inspecting wrecked Panthers noticed entry holes smaller than expected, hinting at the use of a sub-caliber projectile. The mystery was solved when unexploded shells recovered near disabled tanks were analyzed. The Americans had introduced tungsten-cored ammunition. The finding carried major strategic consequences. Germany had developed its own tungsten core ammunition, the Panzergranate 40, to achieve similar results. But by late 1944, tungsten supplies were so limited that production had to prioritize machine tools rather than tank shells. The realization that the Americans could distribute tungsten-cored rounds widely to frontline units proved that their industrial output and access to critical resources far exceeded Germany's capacity. American armor was not only more numerous and better supplied, but now equipped with ammunition that reduced the advantage of Germany's carefully engineered armor protection. The influence of HVAP ammunition reached far beyond the immediate outcome at Arracourt. As news spread among American tank battalions that the new round could pierce Panthers under the right conditions, crews grew more confident in facing German armor head-on. The paralysis that had gripped some tank units during the brutal Normandy fighting began to fade. Crews still respected the Panther's deadly firepower, but no longer regarded it as an unbeatable foe. This transformation in morale proved decisive in the months ahead. A crew that believes it can prevail will move boldly, taking initiative and seeking favorable ground. One that doubts its chances will hesitate, allowing the enemy to dictate the fight. HVAP ammunition, though always in short supply, gave American crews a psychological and practical weapon to contest the battlefield on more equal footing. Even tankers who never fired an HVAP round drew reassurance from knowing such ammunition existed and might appear when needed most. Commanders, however, had to make difficult decisions about how best to allocate their scarce HVAP stock among the units most likely to face German heavy armor in coming battles. Tank destroyer battalions, whose primary mission was anti-armor combat, received priority access to high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. Sherman crews, expected to both support infantry and face enemy tanks, often received fewer rounds despite encountering German armor more often. This imbalance created friction between battlefield needs and logistical realities. The complex allocation process, spanning from Army headquarters down to battalion level, produced uneven results. Some units received more HVAP than they could immediately expend, while others ran dry within days and saw their resupply requests denied due to strained supply lines. When German forces launched their surprise assault in the Ardennes in December 1944, American armored units once again came under tremendous pressure. The Battle of the Bulge brought hundreds of Panthers and Tigers into action under winter conditions that favored the defense and reduced Allied air effectiveness because of persistent bad weather. U.S. Sherman crews depended heavily on their limited HVAP stockpiles to counter the heavier German tanks. Within days, the shortage became dire. Entire units depleted their HVAP ammunition and found that their pleas for resupply went unanswered as supply convoys struggled through snowbound roads disrupted by German attacks. Yet even amid the chaos of the Ardennes fighting, American forces proved that tactical discipline and coordinated arms could offset the Germans' technical superiority. Tank crews operated in close cooperation with infantry, who used bazookas to attack Panthers at close range, while Shermans provided suppressive fire. Forward artillery observers directed precision fire missions that shattered optics, damaged treads, and killed exposed crewmen even when shells failed to pierce armor. Once the weather cleared in late December and January, Allied air power returned to the skies, thunderbolts and typhoons inflicting devastating losses on German armor trapped along narrow approach routes. The Battle of the Bulge ended with Germany's armored strength effectively broken. Hundreds of tanks and trained crews were lost in an offensive that achieved none of its strategic objectives. By early 1945, the balance of power had decisively and permanently shifted to the Allies. American and British armies were preparing for the crossing of the Rhine, while Soviet forces advanced from the east, smashing through weakened German lines in vast winter offensives. Meanwhile, Germany's industrial system was collapsing under relentless Allied bombing, territorial losses that stripped it of key materials and factories, and critical shortages of fuel, steel, and tungsten. Panther production, which had peaked at roughly 3,900 units during 1944, declined sharply in the early months of 1945 as factories were destroyed, rail transport disrupted, and essential metals became unavailable. Even newly completed tanks often never reached the battlefield. Fuel shortages left them stranded. In the final months of the war, German crews frequently abandoned vehicles not from enemy action, but simply from lack of fuel. The less discussed technical weaknesses of HVAP ammunition, however, deserve acknowledgement for historical accuracy. Although the tungsten carbide core was extremely effective under optimal conditions, it had inherent fragility. At lower velocities, below roughly 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, the core could fracture on impact instead of piercing the target. As a result, HVAP performance dropped sharply at extended ranges where projectile speed had diminished. Its reliable engagement distance against Panther mantlets was around 1,000 meters. Beyond that, the risk of the core shattering increased dramatically. American crews discovered these limits firsthand, often with fatal consequences. Crews that fired HVAP from too far away squandered precious ammunition and exposed themselves to deadly return fire from German guns that remained lethal at greater ranges. Training in correct HVAP use was limited. The new ammunition reached combat units faster than formal instruction manuals. Many tankers learned how to employ it effectively only through experience, often in the middle of intense fighting. One well-documented incident involving Sergeant Francis Baker on November 20th, 1944, demonstrated both the promise and constraints of HVAP in action. His Sherman, mounting a 76mm gun and carrying HVAP shells, engaged a Panther at about 800 yards. Baker's gunner fired 7 rounds, scoring multiple hits on the German tank's side armor. To Baker's dismay, every shot failed to penetrate. The rounds ricocheted harmlessly. The encounter proved that even HVAP had notable shortcomings when striking sloped armor at angled trajectories. Though the Panther eventually disengaged instead of continuing the fight, the skirmish served as a sobering reminder that HVAP was no miracle weapon. Sound tactics, precise aiming, accurate range estimation, and exploiting terrain remained essential to survival. HVAP greatly improved an American tanker's chances, but victory still depended on competence and judgment. Post-war studies of HVAP ammunition documented both its strengths and weaknesses. When used against the Panther's gun mantlet within about 1,000 meters, HVAP performed impressively, often penetrating cleanly and triggering ammunition explosions inside. But against the frontal glacis, it was generally ineffective except at extremely short distances and under ideal firing angles. The sharp slope of the Panther's armor caused the tungsten core to either glance off or shatter even at high velocity. This reality required Sherman crews to maneuver aggressively for better shot placement, striking from the sides whenever conditions allowed. The ammunition did not transform the Sherman into a peer of the Panther, but it finally gave its crews a practical chance in fights that once seemed hopeless. Another test came during the Korean War, which began in June 1950. American forces, operating improved M4A3E8 Shermans with 76mm guns, encountered Soviet T-34-85 tanks used by North Korean and later Chinese forces. Unlike in World War II, when tungsten supplies were critically limited, post-war abundance allowed large HVAP reserves to be readily available. In Korean combat, American gunners discovered that HVAP shells could easily pierce the T-34-85's armor at standard battle distances. Though the T-34-85 was a capable machine, its armor protection was far weaker than that of the Panther. Its 90mm thick turret face and 45mm glacis could not withstand tungsten-cored rounds fired from the high-velocity 76mm guns. As a result, U.S. Shermans achieved highly favorable kill ratios, aided by skilled crews and abundant ammunition supplies. The success of the 76mm Sherman in Korea offered vindication, but it carried a bittersweet tone for veterans of Europe. The ammunition that could have changed outcomes in 1944 and 1945 now proved devastatingly effective in Asia, where material shortages were no longer an obstacle. Post-war German accounts about American HVAP, drawn from interrogations and captured documents, reflected grudging respect and deep irritation. German ordnance specialists conceded that U.S. industry had mastered tungsten-core projectile production far more effectively, even though Germany had invented the principle first. The German Panzergranate 40 series embodied the same idea, yet limited tungsten supplies meant very few rounds were ever available. By contrast, despite facing similar constraints, American production volumes by late 1944 surpassed Germany's by a wide margin. Captured German tankers later described the upgraded American ammunition as a serious and unexpected complication. Once they realized that Sherman guns could penetrate Panther mantlets under battlefield conditions, they no longer trusted their frontal armor to keep them safe. This forced a shift toward caution, slower movement, and reliance on defensive setups. That defensive posture, however, ceded initiative to the Americans, who excelled at coordinated combined arms operations. The collapse of the psychological belief in armor invincibility fed into the increasingly defensive doctrine of German armored warfare in 1945. Technical analysis of HVAP fragments recovered from destroyed Panthers provided German engineers with detailed insight into the design of American tungsten-core ammunition. The tungsten carbide core, encased in lightweight aluminum components, represented an ingenious conservation of precious materials that maximized armor-piercing strength while reducing tungsten use per shell. The lighter casing enabled higher muzzle speeds without increasing barrel erosion, while the dense core of tungsten maintained momentum far better than steel projectiles over range. German scientists understood these strengths, but lacked both the industrial scale and material supply to replicate them. By the closing months of 1944, German production priorities had shifted entirely towards sustaining existing tank and ammunition output rather than designing new munitions. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun already delivered formidable penetration with its standard rounds against Allied armor, so refining ammunition types was not viewed as vital. Any new design would require tungsten Germany could not spare and reconfiguration of factories already crippled by Allied bombing. Thus, during the war's last year, German tanks continued to rely on ammunition patterns first introduced in 1942 and 1943, even as American ordnance steadily evolved. The Battle of Arracourt's deeper meaning extended well beyond immediate battlefield statistics. It conclusively proved that U.S. armored doctrine centered on speed coordination between arms' logistical superiority and vast material resources could reliably counter German tactics based mainly on mechanical superiority. German planners had built their 1944 Panzer brigades around the Panther's capabilities, assuming that firepower and armor would make up for untrained personnel and minimal support. This belief collapsed disastrously. Observers on both sides drew the same conclusion. Technological refinement provided advantages, but mastery of operational doctrine, efficient logistics, and comprehensive training were ultimately more decisive for victory. The influence of HVAP on the mindset of individual tankers deserves consideration beyond technical discussion. For American crews who had once fought Panthers with standard shells during the grim Normandy fighting, the introduction of HVAP offered renewed confidence. The ammunition did not remove the Panther's danger entirely, but gave a realistic possibility of success under the right conditions. That morale boost translated into improved combat initiative and greater aggressiveness. For German tankers, the realization that Allied guns could now pierce their armor frontally transformed their battlefield behavior. Otto Carius, the renowned Tiger commander and one of Germany's most successful aces, later described in his memoirs how devastating it felt to lose faith in one's armor. The belief in near invulnerability, he noted, sustained courage and decisiveness in battle. When that belief vanished, performance dropped sharply. Panther crews encountering HVAP-armed Shermans experienced exactly that decline in assurance. Their gun mantlets became recognized weak spots that skilled American gunners could target. This awareness made many German crews slower to engage, less confident, and more defensive in action. The broader consequences of HVAP development illuminate a wider truth about technological rivalry in warfare and the indispensable role of industrial might. Both nations possessed advanced engineers and a deep grasp of ballistics and armor theory. Both recognized the promise of tungsten-core designs early on and succeeded in building working prototypes. The key divergence lay not in scientific ability, but in manufacturing strength and access to resources. American factories could mass-produce HVAP in quantities sufficient to affect combat outcomes, though never enough to supply every front, while Germany's restricted economy managed barely enough for experimentation. This trend repeated across many of the war's weapon programs. Germany produced technically advanced and often superior systems, but failed to manufacture them in numbers sufficient to influence the wider course of the conflict. The United States, by contrast, turned out simpler yet exceptionally reliable weapons in overwhelming quantities. Measured purely by specifications, the M4 Sherman was not the finest tank of World War II, yet American factories produced about 49,324 of them, compared with only 6,132 Panthers. This production margin of roughly 8-to-1, combined with innovations such as HVAP ammunition that reduced the performance gap, proved decisive on the strategic level. The post-war paths of those who fought at Arracourt reveal how profoundly these battles shaped later military doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion during the battle, would later become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and lend his name to the M1 Abrams main battle tank. His wartime experience cemented beliefs in the value of combined arms coordination, disciplined crew training, and the absolute necessity of proper ammunition supply. The M1 Abrams reflected those lessons, equipped with a 120mm smoothbore gun and advanced penetrators made from depleted uranium, serving the same tactical purpose HVAP had filled during World War II. Veterans from the German side, particularly those who had served in Panther formations and later entered the Bundeswehr, carried away different but equally important insights. They had seen firsthand the futility of having technological superiority without the logistics and industrial backing to sustain it. During the Cold War, West German tank doctrine focused on quality, readiness, and crew proficiency, while accepting that Soviet forces would always hold the numerical edge. Experience taught Bundeswehr strategists to prioritize ammunition performance as a key equalizer. The Leopard 1 and later the Leopard 2 main battle tanks embodied this philosophy, featuring advanced rounds developed from wartime understanding that projectile design and crew skill could outweigh armor thickness alone. The end of World War II in Europe, marked by Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, removed the immediate requirement for HVAP shells against Panthers. American ordnance teams that inspected destroyed German tanks found unmistakable HVAP penetration marks on several wrecks, clear proof of the round's effectiveness when employed under proper conditions, though also revealing its shortcomings. Panthers struck by HVAP typically exhibited entry holes through the turret face or gun mantlet at advantageous angles, but almost never through the glacier's plate, which remained notably resistant. These findings supported U.S. tactical doctrine, emphasizing maneuver flanking and creating conditions for effective engagement. Post-war assessments concluded that while HVAP significantly enhanced Sherman effectiveness against heavy German armor, the key to Allied victory still rested on overwhelming numbers, superior logistics, absolute air dominance, powerful artillery coordination, and refined operational doctrine. The evolution of American tank crews from mid-1944 to early 1945 reflected this growing advantage. Combat exposure, upgraded weaponry, and increased familiarity with specialized ammunition transformed morale and performance. Tankers who had landed in Normandy uneasy about confronting Panthers and Tigers were, by 1945, far more assured in battle, benefiting from experience, better equipment, and the knowledge that HVAP rounds could give them a genuine fighting chance. This change in mindset produced immediate battlefield results. Crews who gained confidence fought with greater aggression, seized opportunities more boldly, and exploited every tactical edge. Although HVAP ammunition alone did not cause this transformation, its presence and demonstrated reliability played an important role in raising morale and enhancing American armored effectiveness. The influence of HVAP research endures in modern ammunition technology. Since 1945, American armored doctrine has repeatedly stressed the centrality of ammunition performance to overall tank effectiveness. Contemporary tank rounds employ penetrators of depleted uranium or tungsten alloys, materials selected for the same density and hardness that made tungsten carbide so valuable during the Second World War. The guiding concept remains unchanged. focus maximum kinetic energy into a compact, ultra-dense projectile traveling at extreme velocity. The evolution from 1944's HVAP to today's armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds demonstrates the direct technological lineage linking wartime innovation to modern armament. Soviet and later Russian developments in anti-armor ammunition followed parallel trajectories, reaching similar conclusions about how projectile materials and velocity govern penetrative ability. The global field of tank ammunition traces its foundational innovations to the HVAP program, where designers first proved that tailored ammunition could partly negate the advantages of superior armor. On September 19, 1944, when First Lieutenant Merwin Marston's Sherman crews first fired HVAP rounds against Panthers at Arracourt, armored warfare entered a new psychological era. German tankers who had once relied on their thick armor discovered that American guns now posed a genuine frontal danger. U.S. crews, who had previously felt at a disadvantage, drew real confidence from knowing their ammunition could pierce Panthers under favorable conditions. This mutual shift in perception, brought about by tungsten-cored shells produced by American industry, shaped the dynamics of every major armored clash in Europe that followed. Though HVAP rounds were never available in the quantities commanders desired, they still granted enough of an advantage to turn many American tank units from hesitant defenders into assertive attackers capable of confronting German armor head-on. Those first tankers who witnessed tungsten cores cutting through once impenetrable steel proved that the intelligent application of industrial strength and materials science could overcome daunting technical barriers. This enduring lesson, earned through bitter fighting across the European continent, remains directly relevant to modern strategists confronting the technological realities of contemporary warfare.